In September 1992, a group of hunters delving into the wilds of Alaska discovered an abandoned bus. On its door was attached a note, a desperate plea for help, written in a trembling hand on a torn-out page from a passerby, begging to save him. He wrote that he was mortally ill, too weak to go further, and completely alone. What they found inside would forever change the perception of how far a person can go in search of freedom. At that moment, no one yet knew that this story would become one of the most discussed dramas about survival in the wilderness. A story about dreams and their collision with reality, about the thin line between bravery and recklessness, the story of a man whose name would later become known to the whole world. At the end of April 1992, spring was just beginning in Alaska. The Stampede Trail, where this story unfolded, lies 32 kilometers from the small town of Healy, the last outpost before the endless Alaskan wilderness. There are no permanent residents here, only rare hunters and occasional wanderers. In these parts, nature does not forgive mistakes. Sharp temperature fluctuations require thorough preparation and knowledge of the terrain. Rivers fed by meltwaters become treacherous traps. Their currents strengthen, and fords passable in winter on ice turn into raging streams. Wild animals, grizzly bears, wolves, make these places even more dangerous. Behind the seeming serenity of spring nature hides a harsh reality of the edge where man is merely a guest, and any mistake can cost a life. It was here, into the very heart of wild Alaska, that a young man was heading, whose story would change the perception of what people are capable of in pursuit of their dream. Christopher McCandless, a 24-year-old university graduate, an all-around student, an athlete, an excellent student outwardly, he was the embodiment of the American dream. Born into a well-off family, having received an education at the prestigious Emory University, he had everything that young people usually strive for. But behind this facade of a successful life hid a man who saw the world differently. Even in his student years, Chris displayed traits unusual for his environment. He could eat rice for weeks, although he had money for pocket expenses, refused new clothes. In his room, there were hardly enough things for one backpack. He was an avid lover of books, especially attracted to the works of writers like Thoreau, Tolstoy, and London, finding in their writings a reflection of his own thoughts about freedom, honesty, and simplicity of life. In May 1990, right after graduating from university, Chris took a step that shocked everyone who knew him. He donated all his savings, $24,000, to charity, left his car, burned the remaining cash in his wallet, and left home without telling anyone about his plans. He completely broke with his past life, taking a new name, Alexander Supertramp. The next 2 years became for him a journey not only across the country but also to himself. He hitchhiked across all of America, worked odd jobs, lived extremely simply. In South Dakota, he harvested crops. In California, he washed dishes in a diner. In Arizona, he worked at McDonald's. But he didn't stay anywhere for long. As soon as he earned a little money for food, he set off again. The few who got to know him closer during these wanderings spoke of an amazing combination of firmness of convictions and softness in communication. He could talk for hours about literature or philosophy but never imposed himself. With his charisma, he nevertheless avoided deep attachments, as if afraid that they might become an anchor holding him back from his main goal. His goal was absolute freedom. Freedom from money, from obligations, from societal conventions. He aspired to a pure, unclouded experience of life where a person is left one-on-one with nature and himself. Alaska, in his imagination, was not just a destination. It was a symbol of this freedom, the last frontier where one could still find true wild nature. On April 28, 1992, local electrician Jim Gallion picked up a young hitchhiker on the highway. The guy was lightly dressed, worn jeans, a thin jacket, old sneakers. With him, only a small backpack and a rifle. He introduced himself as Alex and asked to be taken to the beginning of the Stampede Trail. On the way, they got talking. Gallion, an experienced Alaskan resident, noted with alarm how little gear his passenger had. 5 kilograms of rice, a light sleeping bag, a few books. That was all the luggage for life in the wilds. No warm clothes, no map of the area, no compass. When he offered to buy him the necessary gear and food, the guy politely but firmly refused. He had his own philosophy, to test himself in a confrontation with wild nature, relying only on his own strength. Stopping at the beginning of the trail, Gallion tried one last time to dissuade his strange passenger. He told about the treachery of spring weather, about sudden weather changes, about how easy it is to get lost in these places. But in the young man's gaze, there was such determination that all arguments seemed powerless. The only thing that the guy accepted was a pair of rubber boots. Saying goodbye, he asked Galleon to photograph him against the background of the trail sign. A smiling, full of enthusiasm young man raised his hand in a farewell gesture. What would happen after this figure disappeared around the bend of the forest trail would forever remain in the memory of all who came into contact with him. Already on the second day, the river rose, flooding the ford. In his diary, he briefly noted this episode, Day 2, fall through ice. But real luck came on the fourth day of the journey, 30 kilometers from the beginning of the trail. He discovered an old bus under route number 142. Day 4, magic bus, he wrote in his diary, not hiding his joy at the find. The bus became his home and fortress. Inside, there was an old potbelly stove, a few rickety shelves. Chris arranged the space, creating a semblance of coziness. Books neatly arranged, sleeping bags spread by the stove, a homemade shelf for storing supplies. He began to lead a measured life full of daily cares for food and warmth. Hunting was not easy. With a small .22 caliber rifle, he could only hunt small game. Squirrels, ptarmigans, rarely geese. Every day was a struggle for sustenance. Not everything was so rosy. The nights were still cold, and spring rains turned the surroundings into a swamp. Mosquitoes that appeared with the warming turned life into a constant battle. The broken bus windows let in hordes of insects from which there was no escape even at night. In the diary, the first notes of fatigue appear. Day 14, suffering. But there were also joyful moments. By the end of the month, he managed to shoot a wild duck. Day 30, first luscious duck, he triumphed. A small hunting triumph. But the main test was loneliness. For a person who had spent the last 2 years in constant motion, meeting new people in roadside cafes, on farms, and in small towns, such absolute isolation felt especially acute. If before he could talk for hours with random fellow travelers or share thoughts with those who gave him work, now his only interlocutors were books, Thoreau, Tolstoy, London. Chris read for hours, made notes in the margins, reflected. In his diary, he increasingly philosophized. In June 1992, nature became generous. More game appeared, berry bushes bloomed, days became warmer. Chris adapted to life in the wilderness, learned to read animal tracks, find edible plants. He took photos of his life, posing with prey, reading by the fire, standing against the bus with a raised hand. In all the shots, he smiles, but his figure becomes increasingly thin. On the 43rd day of staying in the wilderness, an event occurred that could change everything. Chris shot a moose, a huge luck for an inexperienced hunter with a small caliber rifle. This was his largest prey, capable of feeding him for long weeks. Day 43, moose. But euphoria quickly turned to despair. Not having experience in butchering large game and not knowing the proper ways to store meat, he made a series of fatal mistakes. In the conditions of spring thaw, the meat began to spoil faster than he could process it. Attempts to smoke the prey were unsuccessful. The smoke was too weak, and the meat remained raw inside. Day after day, he watched as his grandiose victory turned into a catastrophe. The loss of such an amount of valuable meat became a heavy blow for him. This was not just a failure in hunting. This was a cruel reminder of how unprepared he was for life in the wild. The diary in those days filled with gloomy reflections on his own incompetence. By the beginning of July 1992, Chris made the decision to leave the bus and return to civilization. 2 months of meager nutrition and constant struggle for survival exhausted him physically. The supplies were running out. Hunting was becoming less successful every day. It took more strength to get food, and energy was becoming less. After the catastrophe with the moose, it became clear that his skills were not enough for long-term survival in these places. Gathering his few belongings, he set off on the return journey. But nature prepared a harsh surprise for him. The Teclanica River, which he easily crossed in April on the frozen bed, now turned into a raging stream. Meltwaters from the mountains turned it into a mass of water more than 20 meters wide. For several days, Chris searched for a way to cross the river. He walked along the bank, trying to find a narrower place or a natural ford, but everywhere he was met with the same picture: a powerful current capable of knocking down anyone who dared to enter it. In the diary, an alarming entry appeared. Rain drove inside. River seems impassable. Lonely. Scary. On July 8th, after several unsuccessful attempts to find a crossing, he returned to the bus. That moment of despair, anger at his unpreparedness, fear of the unknown, disappointment from realizing that his dream of merging with wild nature turned into a trap. He did not know that just 1.5 kilometers downstream there was a hand-operated cable crossing, marked on maps that he had once refused to take. Now the bus from a refuge turned into a prison. Supplies were running out, strength was waning, and uncertainty lay ahead. But even at this moment, Chris did not give up. He continued to hunt, gather plants, keep a diary. His will to live remained unbroken, although physical exhaustion was becoming more noticeable. After returning to the bus, the situation rapidly deteriorated. Chris's ration became increasingly meager. If before he could afford small portions of rice supplemented with game and berries, now food was barely enough to maintain strength. Hunting required energy that was becoming less, a vicious circle from which he could not break free. At the end of July, an alarming entry appeared in the diary. When rice supplies were almost exhausted, Chris began to more actively seek alternative food sources. Among the books he took with him was a guide to local plants. Following its instructions, he discovered and began to collect roots and seeds of wild potatoes, plants that local residents had traditionally used for food. But something went wrong. With each day, his condition worsened. In the diary, an entry appeared, made in capital letters as if a last cry for help. Extremely weak, fault of potato seeds, huge difficulties just to stand up, starving, great danger. He associated his weakness precisely with the seeds of this plant. Chris did not know that during the ripening period, the seeds could contain a toxin especially dangerous for an exhausted organism. His body, already weakened by months of malnutrition, was now fighting not only hunger but also possible poisoning. Muscles rapidly thinned. The hunts came back empty-handed. Squirrels and birds that he had easily hunted before now seemed unattainable. Hands trembled, vision blurred. The diary entries became very short. He still noted each day, but now they were just crosses, like a prisoner's calendar counting days until release. Only occasionally short notes about found berries or health status appeared. The last detailed entry in the diary is dated the 107th day of staying in the bus. Just 2 words, beautiful blueberries. In this brief note, the beauty of the surrounding world and the tragedy of a man for whom a few found berries became an event worthy of recording in the diary amazingly combined. In August 1992, his position became critical. On a torn-out page from Gogol, he wrote a desperate message, attaching it to the bus door. This was a plea for help addressed to random wanderers. He admitted that he was wounded, too weak to get out on his own, and on the brink of death. Twice underlining the phrase, "This is no joke," he begged anyone who found the note to stay and help. Despite the critical condition, he continued to maintain a certain order in the diary, still from beautiful blueberries, the last text entry in the diary. After it, another 6 days are marked with simple crosses. In these last days, something changed in his worldview. On the margins of Boris Pasternak's book, Dr. Zhivago, he left a short but profound message. Happiness is only real when shared, but even in this state, he found the strength to smile at the camera, holding in his hands a homemade poster. On it, he said goodbye, thanked for the wonderful time, and asked not to follow his example. It seemed he felt that his story might inspire other adventure seekers to a similar risky path. The 113th day became the last marked. He put his diary, photos, and documents nearby. Books remained, faithful companions of his solitude, now covered with notes and reflections in the margins. His last refuge turned into a kind of time capsule storing the story of a man who sought absolute freedom but found death. On September 6, 1992, a group of hunters led by Butch Killian discovered bus number 142. The group planned to use the bus as a temporary shelter. This was common practice for hunters in these places. But what caught their attention was the note on the door, written on a torn-out page from a book. Entering inside, they smelled a characteristic sharp odor. In the far corner of the bus, in a sleeping bag that at first they took for a bag of spoiled food, they discovered the body of a young man. Nearby, his documents were neatly folded, certifying his identity. They reported by radio, and the next day, police and the coroner arrived at the scene. The body was so emaciated that a small backpack was enough for the sports bag. The Alaska State Coroner recorded death as a result of starvation. The body weighed only about 30 kilograms. Considering that Chris was a young, healthy man about 1.73 m tall, such weight spoke of losing more than half of his normal body mass. Besides obvious emaciation, no injuries or signs of violence were found on the body. This refuted and confirmed that the word "wounded" in the note rather reflected his general condition than a specific injury. In the bus, his diary was found, a camera with exposed film. The ration, consisting lately of berries and occasional small game, could not provide the necessary amount of calories for survival. The body began to consume itself, first fat reserves, then muscle tissue, and finally began to fail at the cellular level. This explained both the weakness and the inability to hunt, a typical vicious circle of starvation death. However, in 1993, journalist Jon Krakauer, who began his own investigation for a magazine, proposed another theory. In Chris's diary, he paid special attention to the entry from July 30th, where it spoke of weakness caused by wild potato seeds. Krakauer conducted his own research on the plant that Chris likely collected according to the guide. Initially, Krakauer assumed that the seeds contain the alkaloid solanine, which can be toxic. However, further research conducted in 2000 jointly with chemist Ronald Hamilton revealed another toxin, beta-ODAP. This neurotoxin, contained in the seeds during their ripening period, is capable of causing irreversible paralysis known as latherism. In normal conditions, its concentration is too small to harm a healthy person. But for an exhausted organism deprived of fat and protein reserves, it could become deadly. This theory would explain the strange dynamics of Chris's fading. Why a person who successfully hunted and gathered food for 2 months suddenly began to weaken rapidly. Why even those small portions of food he managed to get could not support his strength. The toxin from the plant blocks the absorption of nutrients at the cellular level. The body literally dies of starvation even in the presence of food. However, the scientific community divided in the assessment of this version. Thomas Clausen, a chemist from the University of Alaska, in 2007 conducted an analysis of seeds collected in the same area. His research did not reveal dangerous concentrations of either ODAP or other toxins. He claimed that the seeds are safe, and Chris died simply from starvation. Moreover, local residents have used this plant for food for centuries without any negative consequences. Some experts proposed an alternative version, possible poisoning by mold. In conditions of high humidity inside the bus, seeds or rice remnants could be covered with fungus producing mycotoxins. This theory would also explain the sudden deterioration of the condition, but like the ODAP version, could not be verified due to the cremation of the body. Most likely, Chris's death was the result of a combination of several factors. Prolonged malnutrition undermined his immunity and ability to absorb nutrients. In these conditions, even a small amount of toxins, whether from seeds or mold, could become the last straw. His organism, already on the brink, simply could not cope with the additional load. The final unraveling of this tragedy remained inaccessible. The body of Chris was cremated, which made further investigations impossible. But perhaps the exact cause of death is not so important. The main thing is what happened in those last days of August 1992 in the old bus in Alaska. This is a deep realization reflected in the note on the margins of the book. Happiness is only real when shared. On September 13, 1992, the McCandless family received the news that every parent fears. After 2 years of complete uncertainty, they learned of their son's death. The news came from the Alaska police. The body was identified by fingerprints. For the parents who had been searching for Chris all this time, hiring detectives, this was a crushing blow. In the summer of the following year, Walt and Billy McCandless made a pilgrimage to the place of their son's death. They reached bus 142, where they spent several hours trying to understand the last days of Chris's life. Inside, they left a memorial plaque. Chris, our beloved son and brother, died here in August 1992. They also left a first aid kit and a supply of food, as if trying to protect other wanderers from the fate of their son. Corrine, Chris's younger sister, experienced the loss especially hard. She was the only family member with whom he maintained contact after leaving, although he did not reveal his plans. In her memoirs, she wrote, "I lost not only a brother but also my best friend. Part of me died with him in that bus." The family agreed to cremation. On Chris's birthday, They climbed to the top of a mountain in California and scattered his ashes. The place was chosen not by chance. Chris loved mountains. They symbolized the freedom he so desperately sought. On that day, an eagle flew over the mountains. For the family, this became a symbol that Chris's spirit finally found the freedom he sought. And then his book, Into the Wild, made this story known to the whole world. In 2007, Sean Penn made a film based on it, which further intensified interest in the fate of the young wanderer. Bus number 142 became a place of pilgrimage for thousands of people from all over the world. But this popularity had a dark side. Over the years since Chris's death, several people died trying to reach the bus. Others found themselves in dangerous situations. The Teclanica River that stopped Chris continued to be a deadly barrier for unprepared travelers. In 2020, the Alaska authorities made a decision. The bus was evacuated by helicopter, putting an end to dangerous pilgrimages. Today, Bus 142 is in a museum in Fairbanks, cleaned of rust but preserving the traces of time. It continues to tell the story of Chris McCandless, about the search for oneself, about the thirst for freedom, about the thin line between dream and recklessness. Alaskan residents still argue about Chris's legacy. For some, he is a romantic hero who challenged consumer society. For others, an unprepared idealist whose story should serve as a warning. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle. In his last note about happiness being real only when shared, Chris seems to have found the answer to the question that drove him further into the wilderness. It's a pity that this epiphany came too late. In the end, this story is not so much about survival or death as about the search, about the eternal human striving to find one's path, to understand oneself and one's place in the world. And perhaps the main lesson here is not how far one can go in search of freedom, but that true freedom is not escape from the world but the ability to find oneself in it. Chris McCandless's dream turned into a final imprisonment within the walls of a rusty bus. He sought independence but in the end realized that true happiness is possible only when it can be shared with others. This thought, written on the margins of a book by a fading person, was his last discovery and perhaps the most important lesson of this story. And now let's think. Was Chris a hero who dared to break with consumer society and go his own way? Or an irresponsible dreamer whose pride did not allow him to admit his unpreparedness? Where does the line pass between courage and recklessness? And most importantly, if you had the opportunity to talk to Chris before his departure to Alaska, what would you say to him? Write in the comments your opinion about this story. If you liked it, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Ahead of us are many more stories about people who challenged fate and reached the limits of human capabilities. Thank you for watching and see you in the next episodes.